Please be seated. Now, Janice tells me at this early service I only have 45 minutes for preaching. That's right. Yeah. Well, don't feel cheated if you only get the 40-minute sermon then, so relax. I have always been fascinated by the fact that every year on the Sunday immediately after Easter, we read this gospel lesson. Whether it's year A, B, or C in the lectionary, this selection, Doubting Thomas, shows up. Now, we don't know a lot about Thomas, and it's rather unfortunate that he gets this nickname, Doubting Thomas. It's come to be a phrase in the English language because, well, he has his moments, but he, of course, goes on. And while there are not tremendous stories about Thomas in the Bible, there are tremendous stories that grow up within the Christian community about Thomas's work after the events recounted in Scripture. He supposedly went east through Iraq and Iran, through Persia, preaching the gospel, making it all the way to India. When the British get to India, they find an ancient Christian church that calls itself the Children of Thomas, and they worship Jesus. But they remember that Thomas was the apostle who brought them Christianity. This ancient Indian church is not Catholic, it is not Protestant, it's not Orthodox, it is its own little, I shouldn't say little, but its own thing. And I mention it and go into some detail because lo and behold, when I moved to Dallas, I found out that there are 4 or 5 Mar Thoma congregations in Dallas. And it turns out that the Mar Thoma church in this country is fairly well represented in the medical community. So Temple being a medical community, sooner or later, I suspect one of you is going to run into a Mar Thoma Christian. And just in case you do, now you know that they were evangelized by Thomas, and perhaps just as importantly, they are in full communion with the Episcopal Church. And we act very closely together, and the congregations of the Mar Thoma Church and the congregations of the Episcopal Church are at so close that we should at least be called cousins. So, there's your history lesson for today. But I want to go back to Thomas. Doubting Thomas, he's called. Now, the story really has 2 episodes. The first episode takes place on Easter Day in the evening. The disciples are gathered together, and Jesus shows up. Now, the text says that the doors are locked for fear of the Jews, but the picture really isn't that the Jews are somehow kept out by these locked doors, because after all, if the police show up, a locked door is not going to keep them out very long, but rather, even though the doors are locked and shut and barred, Jesus just shows up. And I love his first words to the disciples. Hello. Or in Hebrew, Shalom Aleichem. Peace be with you. But it's just the standard, ordinary greeting for hi. And the disciples seem to be a little nonplussed. In fact, I would want to argue that if we just see the story for what it is, there seems to be something left out. Because the very next thing that happens is that Jesus shows them his wounds in his hands, on his side, in his feet. Well, that seems a bit odd to me. Why would Jesus walk in and say, hello, look, I'm bleeding, or I was bleeding? What happened? Surely it has got to be that the disciples gathered together. While some of them have seen the risen Lord, The two disciples from Emmaus have made it back this evening and talked with them. While some of them have indeed seen the risen Lord, surely they have got to be saying to themselves, really? He's alive? We were pretty sure he was dead. Really? Can this be? Surely it's the whole group of disciples who have doubt. And then, because Thomas isn't with them, he shows up later, and he gives voice to the very thing that all of them had been saying. He says, unless I'm able to meet this guy myself, unless you can show me the hole where the nail was, and I put my finger right in there, unless I see that big gash in the side, and I can put my hand right inside that gash, I am not going to believe this. Now, I will say that at this point, I'm identifying with Thomas. I'm a little bit of a hard sell in most things. Perhaps that's my background as a philosophy instructor. Perhaps that's the fact that I've studied Plato and Aristotle and all these people. And so I'm used to weighing truth claims and what's the evidence. And somebody just showing up and says, hi, I used to be dead, now I'm alive, is not going to be terribly convincing right off the bat. I'm going to think about that. And even more, I suspect that a few of you might just be with me. You might, or you've heard the gospel of Jesus, and there are times when I think, to be honest, we all have to say, really? So then, 1 week later, the Sunday after Easter, the disciples are gathered together. Thomas is with them this time. And Jesus shows up and says, hello. And then, turning to Thomas as if he knows exactly what has happened, being Jesus, I suspect he does, he turns to Thomas and he says, Thomas, having a little trouble believing this? Come here. Put your finger in the hole. You want to put your hand in the side? Go ahead. Go ahead. Come on. And then the most miraculous thing happens. Absolutely miraculous. Did you notice it when we read it? Did you notice what Thomas does not do at that point? Thomas has said, I will not believe unless I can put my fingers in the holes. Jesus shows up and says, go ahead, put your finger in the hole. And Thomas does not. Thomas should, by all rights, walk over to Jesus and say, really? Let me see that. He should really walk over to Jesus and say, pull your robe open. I want to see that big gash. Instead, falling to his knees, at least in my mind, as I play out this evening, he says, my Lord and my God. Now, this, I think, speaks directly to those of us who have no trouble with faith and those of us who struggle with the idea of faith. There are folks, and I want to readily acknowledge this, there are people who hear the gospel of Jesus and they know it and believe it and fine, and that's no problem whatsoever. My mama is like that. She always looks at me and says, I just don't get it. How come you struggle with this stuff so much? Why can't you just take him at his word and believe it all? Read the Bible. There it is. And there are people like that. And if you're one of them, I admire you and wonderful for you. There are others, however, who may be a little bit more like me and struggle with the faith, who from time to time may look up into the sky and say, really, Lord? This is what you want me to believe? But here's what Thomas teaches us. that whether or not we have doubt, when Jesus really does show up in your life, the time for questions is over. And those of us who have had encounters with the risen Lord, and I don't just necessarily mean see a vision, hear a voice, a blinding light like St. Paul had, but those of us who know that Jesus has come into our lives, at that point it's time to hang up the doubting. At that point it's time to, as the Scots translation of this passage says, nay, be doubting, but be believing. And what does it mean to believe in Jesus? He spells it right out there for us. Forgive the sins of others as you have been forgiven. It's right there in the passage. If you forgive sins, they will be forgiven. So there's your assignment. Today, this week, I would tell you, go find someone who has sinned against you, but I suspect you don't have to look very hard. I suspect that if you really want to find someone who has sinned against you, you could pull out a mirror. But whether it's another person or yourself, it is time to forgive. And in doing so, you have acted out your faith as a Christian. I think this gospel lesson is repeated every year on this Sunday, precisely for this point. It wants us to not only believe in the resurrection of Jesus, but to know what that believing in the resurrection of Jesus means. It means to forgive other people. Now, you may say that there is someone who has done something so absolutely horrendous, incredible, it is unforgivable. Maybe. I don't know the stories of your life, and there may be traumas in your life. Forgiving another person does not mean simply looking at them and saying, oh, that's all right, you're forgiven, go ahead. I had a parishioner once, owned a small store in town, employed a nephew as a bookkeeper, found out his nephew had been embezzling from him. He forgave him. He also turned him over to the police. There was a trial, and he went to prison. But he visited him every week in prison. And when the young man came out of prison, he had a job at the store. Now, not as a bookkeeper. Forgiving does not mean being stupid. Forgiving does not mean saying it doesn't count. Forgiving means growing up and working with love together as we move forward. That's what this gospel story is all about. Let us be Christians and believe in the resurrection of Jesus and forgive one another.
Worship song